Have you seen the work of Marco Rodriguez on collective decision making? Apparently, it's very much in the idea of the delegation to a network where you say that you trust somebody who trusts somebody who trusts somebody, and in the end, the one who votes can collect a lot of votes from all the ones that are indirectly trusted.
Yeah. So I haven't seen their stuff now.
You should look at it.
Yeah.
It's very nicely explained.
Yeah.
It's something he did 10 years ago, so he hasn't really been developing it, but he formulated it very nicely.
Where is it published or what's the name?
I'll find it. Marco Rodriguez, Marco with a K, and it's called
Smartocracy.
Smartocracy is one of the versions of it, but the previous versions, I think they were called collective decision making or something like that.
Well,
he has several papers about it.
So I know
it's really the, let's say, the mathematical background of what you described.
So the oldest delegated democracy system, or that I've seen proposed, was from the early 60s, and then over the next decade or two, there were at least 4 others who independently suggested it. I had never actually heard of the idea, and I proposed it independently again in an article I wrote in 2008. And shortly thereafter, lots of people came.
2001. So I mean, it's kind of logical that people would think about it, but to work it out as an actual algorithm is not trivial. And the one problem, let's say, where he got stuck was that you can use some kind of a PageRank-like algorithm to calculate how much weight somebody who actually votes has.
Right.
But then there is a problem that you say, I trust this guy in general, no problem.
Right.
I trust this guy for things that have to do with agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
I trust this guy for things that have to do with this particular quota. Then it becomes more tricky because then you need to impose an ontology, and then you ask people to say each time how much do I trust this guy for this person. Because that's because the complicated people can't really say that. Like, I trust my father for politics and I trust my mother for things that have to do with culture, and maybe that might still go, but if it gets more complicated, you would need some kind of an artificial intelligence system to propagate influence in the right way and suggest categories and
or even suggest people. I mean, right? So this is the what if I don't know anyone that's good at politics or good at cooking.
Right. And well, at that point, once you have that kind of mediation, the intent is being mediated on your behalf. Is it still democracy? Are people actually engaging in a democratic way, or are they being coerced into it by the architectural decisions that led to the AI suggesting this person or that person or stuff like that? And this is
I mean, ideally it should be some kind of a self-organizing algorithm that's not biased, that out of the votes kind of finds patterns and uses these to make it easier to vote. But even then, there is possibility to bias.
This is what James C. Scott warned about when he talked about slide rule authoritarianism. Whoever determines the nature of the slide rule determines how everything is measured, and it's. I would like to not take any assumptions about what is good structure into it, but rather just have the broadest possible ways in which people can essentially emerge a structure or participate. So through participation, create a structure through emergence, and not have it kind of thrust at them from any way.
You could actually say, one way that you could view this as a problem today. So, typically, delegated voting has been around for a long time. So even if you look at Marxist analysis of the Paris Commune, you could say, well, the great thing about the Paris Commune was that there was this crazy delegate system going on, where people could be instantly recalled. But the problem with all those systems, when they're based on this sort of heavy degree of localism and instant recallability stuff, at least at that time, because there was no internet, it was unclear how things could scale at all. Right? The problem, though, is when you try to make things scale, you hit certain, I would say, cognitive limits, Dunbar number being sort of an interesting one. How can you still make things scale in a way which retains the sort of human nature of freedom and decision making, but still actually scales, right? Because we don't live in the problem with a lot of the I would say, heavily localist visions of direct democracy, I mean, including municipal libertarianism, Bookchin, and now as we see in Kurdistan, is that it seems fine if you're managing, a small area, a village, even a neighborhood, but when you start managing complex infrastructure whose boundaries are diffuse, which require a lot of technical work to keep running, and actually people's lives depend on that, and there's not a clear alternative. We don't have good answers, I think, right now. I do think the delegated voting thing can be very tricky. At least it's like an attempt to say, well, how can we make something that scales, right?
I have been thinking about the same problem also in a place where it works better. That's within the scientific context. Certain people, scientists, are more authorities than others in a particular domain.
Yeah.
And you can do that in a very stupid way by counting the number of publications in the Web of Science, by counting the number of citations. It already gets better, but you can build better and better algorithms to decide how authoritative is somebody in a particular domain. And then you can use that as a vote that whenever, let's say, you need an expert opinion about a particular domain, the algorithm would find who are the most experts, let them vote, and weigh their vote by the degree of expertise. You would probably get a pretty reliable representation. In science, that would be possible.
But
in democracy, it's already more tricky.
It would be bad for people who are very interdisciplinary and, who are
weak decision making.
Yeah.
No, it depends. It depends on what the problem is about. For some things, you would need interdisciplinary people, and they might have the highest page rank within this interdisciplinary domain.
I mean, there's another interesting perspective, which is how could we minimize the amount of decisions that I mean, how many decisions are made at scale which really need to be made at scale? That's an interesting question, right? So we can't. I mean, there are definitely decision questions that need to be made at scale. Maybe we're overestimating. Maybe a lot of decisions that require sort of complex analysis, if people were properly empowered and engaged, could be made just by the people themselves in their course of everyday action. It's hard to say. So one parallel move within this sort of network, sort of network democracy might be the wrong word, but the network politics movement is the Bitcoin movement. Basically, let's try to decentralize everything absolutely, so everyone has a copy of everyone else's votes, everyone else's records, and somehow basically build from this. And I think that the answer is
decentralization. Indeed, it would be interesting to scale also down. But I'm thinking about a practical example. In my street, there is a blind wall next to the railway. At a certain moment, they wanted to put some graffiti art on it. The municipality suggested that, and then there was a petition against it. But actually, nobody was ever asked anything. And it was then done, but not done the way it was said it would be done. In this case, they could simply have shown the art that they were planning to put on the wall, and just that all the people of the street vote for it. That would have been very local. Nobody else in the rest of the city needs to decide about that, because the people who see it every day are the ones that should normally vote.
There is a thing in governance theory that subsidiarity. So it's kind of one of the big things in the European Union. Always practicing subsidiarity, except most of the time it isn't done. And subsidiarity basically, it's when you have a top-level authority that can delegate the decision-making authority or executive authority for something down to a smaller entity. And in principle, they should always do it when they can. In practice, what happens is they exercise subsidiarity when they don't want to make a decision at the top level or want to avoid a decision being made at all about an issue, so basically making the problem go away, or where they don't want to assume responsibility for having made the decision, and various variants thereof.
Because if you know that it's a decision where any of the alternatives is likely to be unpopular, you let somebody else make it.
Right, so in a paper I did with Primavera de Filippi, we proposed that this flip model of the subsidiarity, where you, instead of assuming in the first instance that all of the power comes from the central government authority at the top, you assume that all of the power ultimately lies with the people, and that in order to make a decision, the smallest, so a person who wants to make a decision needs to get everybody together who has a stake in the decision. And that way you essentially arrive, in the theoretical instance, you would always arrive at the same point. So subsidiarity or supersidiarity gets to the same point. But in practice, you probably wouldn't because...
the problem is that if you start out with a few stakeholders and then you may enlarge the group of stakeholders, the ones that are already there will not be inclined to add others because that would diminish their power.
Yeah.
So,
and there, again, once you have thousands of stakeholders, sorry, it becomes very hard to coordinate everybody. The simple bandwidth of everybody communicating is strictly higher than any one person's bandwidth, or bandwidth capability. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's definitely tricky. So, do you have any other questions or observations?
How do you envision a transition from today's democracy to what we're talking about?
Well, so I'm not very much in favor of revolutions. Historically, they've just got a very bad success ratio, the very low success ratio, and in general, there's jerk is the third derivative of location, right? So you have location, motion, acceleration, and then jerk, which is the change in acceleration. So my approach to politics is a no-jerk theory. So no jerks allowed. You can accelerate, you can decelerate, but just try to not have that kind of disjoint motion where suddenly something new and radical comes along, which in our current societies, you always have, the new government takes over, they come in with new radical ideas and just upend everything overnight, and society is essentially equivalent to a Markov explosion in probability theory, where you have a kind of steady stream of stuff, and then suddenly lots of stuff happens at the same time, and the system gets reset to a random position. So I'd say, any reasonable approach to adopting new kind of participatory systems needs to happen slowly and very deliberately. And coincidentally, that kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that, are you familiar with David Cameron's Big Society thing in the UK? So when he took over in the UK, one of the things he did was he launched this program called the Big Society, where he said, okay, we're going to stop providing these here essential government services, and society is going to be big about it and take over and manage them themselves. Essentially just cutting off. It was basically a way of making austerity measures sound good. Of course, everybody saw through it. But what happened was you had several million people, tens of millions of people, who were not used to having to manage certain things in their society, being given the keys and no adult supervision overnight. And people freaked out, they didn't know what to do. This is very reasonable. Of course you freak out when suddenly you're being told to manage every aspect of your life, when for hundreds of years other people have been managing it for you. So having a slow adoption also gives us time to educate people into this is how the sewage system works. If it fails and everybody dies of cholera, that's a kind of understanding that needs to be embedded into society. And of course, that's one example. But you get what I mean.
I mean, to give us an alternate viewpoint, I would say that, the main problem we're facing today is that it's hard to say when technology is actually accelerating. We could probably say that the technological apparatus, given that we have governments that were whose essential foundations were down in the 18th and 19th century, for the most part, that the technological apparatus has moved faster or is beyond the traditional political governmental apparatus at this point. And then the ways that the traditional political governmental apparatus are adopting the new technological apparatus, such as the NSA, are really strange, at least, or not sort of obvious from a position of domination and power, but not obvious from, let's say, the citizens' democratic so-called rights. Right. So what you're actually seeing is you're seeing that the technologies have the political institutions, and thus, rather than I think having this sort of slow change, what's actually happening today, as I pointed out earlier, is that countries are slowly dissolving, and the center of power has moved away from the nation state into forms of network power. Some of which are really obvious, like corporations are really obvious form of network power that exist in different places. They have a very, as you point out, authoritarian or dictator-like command and control structure. But they are effectively authoritarian, and they are effectively network power. Then you're also seeing other forms of authoritarian network power where the traditional nation state has collapsed or has been engineered to collapse, such as in Iraq, where you have ISIS, right? So you're seeing that I don't think there's this theory of revolution, which I think is a little bit wrong, which is that it's engineered by revolutionaries. It's like a group of people who then like hang out at a cafe and they go outside and they for the government. I mean, I think it has happened in a few cases, but it's fairly rare. And I think what actually tends to happen is, maybe
The
an
Belgian Revolution happened after they were watching an opera.
I heard about this.
Yes, and they came out of the opera building and they were very enthusiastic about what they've seen in the opera, and they started fighting.
Maybe today they've just watched a really good YouTube video outside and overthrow their government. But I think actually what you're actually seeing today, which is I think the worrisome bit of the situation, or that's the most concerning, is that the governments themselves are imploding of their own accord or being destroyed in various sort of geopolitical games, and that until you have something so revolution happens when essentially you have a government collapse and there's some sort of scramble, basically, and a lot of geopolitics usually going on at the same time, and that in this field, the problem is that no one is really offering anything new. So, for example, you could even argue, it's a pretty interesting argument, that because we don't have a concept of network jurisprudence, or we don't have a concept of local self-organized communities, well, of course, after your government's going to be destroyed, you're like, well, you know what would be really great? Would be Sharia law. Like, that would be great. At least that's something stable, because people do need what Smári mentioned, which is that lack of jerk. I mean, it's really upsetting to have your family killed, your house destroyed, your money dissolved value. But these things happen, and they're happening more. And the reason why I think we have to just be realistic is they're happening more and more quickly. And then until you have some of these people will move in and create solutions regardless of what we all think. You can only see that happen, right? So the interesting point about the Google New Digital Age book is saying, well, look, the word government collapses because eventually Google's going to produce services where we can back your government up into the cloud. So people will start, the market almost will drive solutions probably to some extent. But I think the real question is, what is the nature of those solutions? How can we assure that they actually are, that we don't produce the sorts of nightmarish visions that were seen by Mead and Wiener and other people when these topics of cybernetic governance were first broached? How can we produce the kinds of governance that we actually want? And I think that's really, there's not enough people looking at that question. And until people start looking at that question, the default of ISIS or the default of something sort of psychotic like the NSA or whatnot will keep happening. No, it will.
No, so you said something like ISIS or something psychotic like the NSA.
The NSA is a great example of transnational network power.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's really great. I mean, they can bully any government, they give them whatever they want, and they can use their power for really, they actually don't seem to be using it as much as they could, but they could at least directly use it for a lot of political and social purposes. But that's going to keep happening until, and that these forms of new kind of network power that are developing now, they're not being very explicit. They're developing in this very ad hoc, crazy way right now. So there's no one sitting down and being like, oh, you know what we really need in Syria? We need an algorithm.
Yeah.
No one said. But maybe someone could have said that, right?
Although, incidentally,
you could have said that in Egypt at some point, probably in 2011, and maybe people would have bought that.
Thinking in that direction.
There's also this project, this really wacky project called Ethereum. They managed to raise a lot of money to build some kind of, it's a blockchain, so kind of based on Bitcoin, a mechanism by which you can essentially create contracts. Only the way that they're doing it is that they allow you to codify contracts in a Turing-complete language, which means essentially that you have contract law, which isn't a broken thing. Contract law has been working pretty well for at least 8,000 years, give or take. You know, people know how to do contracts. But for some reason, these people decided that this was a problem that needed fixing, and the way that they decided to do it was to have a mechanism by which anybody can run any arbitrary piece of code on any computer they want, but just by adding it to the blockchain, which is just, there's so many reasons why that's a bad idea. But this is the kind of thing, this is exactly people who thought, hey, yes, okay, what we need is an algorithm, without necessarily having a thorough enough understanding of what the society was they're trying to fix.
But then let's go back a step, and is that, you know, historically, you know, governance and culture developed without too much engineering. So you know, the divine right of kings and all this stuff. I mean, there was politically engineered to some extent, but ultimately kind of organically developed, for better or for worse, happened in history, monarchies, for example. Then you had this period with the Enlightenment, where you did have people dealing with constraints they did with like forces. You know, you can't put all delegates. You can only put so many people in one room, and they didn't have low latency communication. They were saying, well, actually, we have to design a government from scratch, because by the way, we just won a war of independence against Britain, or by the way, we just got free from occupation after World War II, or whatever. And this is interesting, and seeing that we're entering that kind of period again, right, it is really interesting. And but the concepts that were driving the initial construction of our governments are mostly concepts from the Enlightenment. And now we're basically being driven by concepts mostly from cybernetics, I would think.
Although
pre-Enlightenment ideals.
I would argue that that actually, so the big demand that the Enlightenment made was we want democracy on the one hand and enlightenment on the other. You know, enlightenment in the sense of access to information. And actually, those are exactly the two things that the Pirate Party in Iceland campaigned on. You know, we were essentially saying, hey, that enlightenment thing that we never really had, how about we have that now? You know, the ideals were nicely hashed out the first time round, worked for a couple of 100 years, but now we want the real thing. So.
Sorry. Just with regards of our ability to successfully build an alternative to, you know, failed nation state, or failing would be more appropriate. I think that until we solve the distributed generation of energy situation, it's not going to happen, because we're still very much dependent on strong institutions that are able to harness the type of energy that we're using.
Yeah, well,
nowadays.
The price of solar panels is dropping like a rock.
Exactly.
I think that's not going to be a hard problem, energy generation. There are other problems which, for instance, agriculture used to be something that 90-some odd % of humanity did, and now it's something that 2 or 3% of humanity do, and everybody is a beneficiary of that. So redistributing that is going to be way harder than distributing electrical generation. And then you also have things like healthcare, vaccine production and distribution. Hospitals are expensive. PET scanners are a really expensive piece of hardware. And you know, there are things like, for instance, ultrasound scanners are a big favourite of mine, because they're really super simple electronics. You know, piezoelectric vibration at 3 to 6 megahertz. You know, it's like super simple, and yet an ultrasound scanner device costs on the order of $25,000 to $30,000. I'm pretty certain that because we have these computational devices in our pockets now that have this like little input thing, or Bluetooth 4 or whatever, we could like build this like little gadget that just connects to this. Really easy to do, yet nobody's doing it.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to start thinking about.
I mean, I think that the price of many instrumentation devices could be dropped by orders of magnitude if somebody's just got to work on it, but it hasn't happened.
Exactly, and it's as important as understanding how we're going to do the sort of political and social side of it.
Yeah.
Because if one thing without the other one, it's not going to happen. Like we won't be able to successfully crystallize these ideas that we're having in terms of social and political arrangements if we don't solve that at the same time.
There is a concept called stacktivism, stacktivism. So it's like activism only with a stack. And it's created by Jay Springett. He's a funny guy in London who basically he took there's an idea created by Vinay Gupta about simple critical infrastructure mapping, which is, what do we need to survive and what bits of infrastructure are providing us with it, and at which layer of society, is it on a personal layer, is it in a town layer, household, or do we get it from the global economy, or what, where does it come from? And Jay essentially took that idea and generalized it out over, way more things, and said, okay, all of human civilization functions on the basis of technology stacks, and if we don't control those technology stacks, we're subjugated, or we live on basically those who control it control us.
Let me use a quick note. I mean, that same point was, that point's been made in the past by everyone from Franz Fanon onwards.
Yeah.
The interesting bit about how this is going to play out in the next few years is that freedom of information is incredibly important, probably in solving all these problems, but not the kind of free information that most people think about. So if you think about, like, for example, open government data, I don't know how it's playing in Belgium, but it's a pretty big deal in the UK. But still mostly, fix my pothole, where is the crime happening in my neighborhood. You don't really see, and there's actually, due to anti-terrorist legislation, in the US at least, it's illegal to see simple critical information, infrastructure information being made available. I would bet that one of the reasons why the Egyptian revolution worked out so crazily with the military essentially always really being in control was that ultimately the military in Egypt was always sort of nationalized and ran the infrastructure. So you can have a sort of market appearance, ephemeral, but essentially the core of that simple critical infrastructure, it has always been in control by the military. So therefore, no matter eventually what sort of elections you have and blah, 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 and protests, they're going to make, as long as they hold that, they'll be in control. And there's not clear how to democratically run that infrastructure, but this is the exact same problem that was encountered even by the Council Communists and other people. And Lenin had a really easy answer, which the party runs it all, right? So that's pretty, that cuts out, makes it really simple. But there were severe problems that were never solved by even the Enlightenment era revolutionary movements when they encountered industrial capital of how to think about and run infrastructure democratically, or how to run it at all, right, in a way which wasn't authoritarian. And the last bit, farming, I actually think might even be one of the more simple ones. And insofar as that, I do agree that the energy production is very difficult. I think it might be harder than solar panels. There's a really interesting book by, what's his name, McKay, the guy, the machine learning guy. So he has this great book called Out of Hot Air. He basically does the numbers just on Britain, because English people don't really often care much outside of Britain. And he said, well, if we wanted to run the whole country of solar panels, we'd have to basically take over the Sahara. We said, no, we could do that.
But that's always a centralized line of thinking.
Exactly.
Right? And one of so solar panels alone aren't going to be sufficient, but there are lots of other techniques that we just haven't been using fully. One thing that's always irked me about nuclear power is that I think nuclear power is a relatively good idea, because we have this stuff that is going to decay naturally in the environment anyway. We might as well make it, put it to good use. Unfortunately, the best idea that people could come up with was, let's hit it with a bunch of neutrons, get it really excited, make it supercritical, and then dip it in water. If that's the best we can do, then we're not in a very good place.
I have a few more ideas.
Yeah, well, but most of the ideas essentially come down to dipping it in water and and running a Stirling engine or a turbine or something.
But just to finish the point, so I want to just finish the point is that if you can imagine that things like open source ecology, a lot of people actually do want to farm and don't have any land, or things like open source movements can be applied to the infrastructure of nuclear power plant, you probably could discover technical ways of solving some of these problems. The governance, I think, might be a bit trickier.
First of all, thank you. It's a very inspiring talk. One of the things that just was raising a question in my mind was, you emphasized some kind of strong analogy between this democratic structure, the law, as a social software project. Isn't that kind of just the tip of the iceberg to social structure? I mean, having a law is one thing, but then the whole cultural dynamics that's changing the society is completely different. It's just apart from law. So you put a lot of emphasis on this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I tried to make so architecture and traditions and markets all function on the same level as law, and to the point where a law which nobody agrees with will not be enforced. Unless of course whoever has the enforcement capability agrees with it and everybody else doesn't, and then things get really nasty. But so I was focusing a lot on law because law is so easy to study, but the same is true of every part of social construct. So things like marriage and religious doctrines also have this kind of society shaping effect on us, and similarly the shape of buildings. All of these things, every part of those four elements will have the same effect. But law is nice because it actually looks a little bit like software. Well, a building doesn't really feel like software to most people. But making that analogy is so good because then you can start to say, well, okay, how about we? What happens if we fork it? What does forking law mean? What does deleting chunks of law mean? Essentially, all of these kind of software development analogies come pretty cleanly into that realm, and that's really what.
Yeah, and how about the effect of the voiceless? I mean, you're very much depending on, let's say, people making decisions.
Yeah.
Well, very often you say, well, we don't have the knowledge, it's beyond our context. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe that's 90% people have voices, or even more than that. So, and still, these people are very important in the dynamics of the culture.
Yeah. So this is you're very right, and we used to society has put a lot of emphasis on making sure everybody is literate, but there are multiple types of literacy, and one is technical literacy, another is just societal literacy, just being able to understand the construction of society and being able to interact with it. And we don't have that. It's kind of depressing how little most people know about how their own government or how their own country is run. And but
even if you go in third world countries, I mean, if you go into the remote places, then there is no need for an overall societal view. It's very local. So, but these people are influenced. But
that statement is scale free. So even if you live in a society of 100 people in the middle of a forest somewhere that never talks to anybody outside, you still need to understand how that society functions.
Sure.
It's way easier to understand probably, but you still and you can totally have, and actually coming from a very small society, I grew up on a small island off the south coast of Iceland, so a very, very small society. Voicelessness actually becomes more of a problem as societies go smaller, because often people are voiceless not because they kind of are getting drowned out in the noise, but because they're just socially ostracized and just can't participate or are being willfully excluded. I don't think any of this stuff will solve that, but what this stuff can do is raise the bar from 63 people being in charge of the Icelandic parliament to why don't we have it at least theoretically 320,000 or whatever the population size is, and then we can try to figure out as a society how we eradicate that kind of marginalization, because that is truly a problem, but it's a different problem.
And let's go back to why is it an interesting thing to consider laws codes. What I was trying to point out is that there is a particular historical turn in thinking of social systems as cybernetic systems. And that, of course, when you're in a period where the traditional institutional framework, for whatever reason, is in a period of sort of dissolution, then it makes sense, in places where you had heavy religious influence, people are going to say, well, okay, what is our law? It's actually our laws. By the way, it's from God. We had it before these stupid nation states. We're going to have it afterwards, right? Sharia law or Christian law or whatever. In societies where a lot of people engaged in I guess the thing which is exciting, interesting, and where society is moving is software development, then people are going to naturally apply, and have been applying since Levi-Strauss about it earlier, but really start applying computational cybernetic metaphors to law, and then actually making that law. And I think the interesting thing, which I try to point out too brief, as regards the Snowden affair, is that when you actually ask, in a period of widespread lawlessness, so you can sort of say everything from nation-state collapse to NSA, widespread lawlessness, there does not seem to be much a lot of law abiding going on. It's felt like, let's say at least. It seems like one way to guarantee law is also not just purely to encourage people to participate, but also to encode the kinds of society, the kinds of world that you want into the techniques themselves, right? So that's one way to so you sort of say, I think people should have the right to communicate in private. We're going to make a law saying you should have the right to communicate in private, and if your privacy is violated, then we'll take them to court. But then the entire court system is dysfunctional. The U.S. is a great example. The entire court system is dysfunctional. No one can take them to court. There's all these security exceptions, blah, blah, blah. It's not possible to actually have that right. Then you have to end up backing out to something like, say, for example, cryptography, like MailPop, which Smári's working on, or other people I work on Web Crypto W3C, trying to make those bits work in a purely technical sense, which is political. It's simultaneously political, but it's a different way of doing politics than is traditionally conceived of in terms of courts and explicitly written laws, because the law is implicit within the technique. I think both will probably end up being very popular in the next few years.
And cryptography essentially is architecture.
Yeah. Sorry to. It was fascinating, but quite disturbing for a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. I have some things to say about your take of law, which is very interesting, but I think there may be a misunderstanding about what law is in fact. You take law as being legal text. For me, legal texts are just politics. They are not law. They are made by representatives, political representatives. That's politics. It's not law. Law is jurisprudence. It's case law. And case law and the scene of the jurisprudential scene is very interesting because it allows for the revision of laws, because it's a stage for contestation sometimes. That ensures the living metabolism of legal normativity, in fact. And when you put the code, the legal code, in the form of hardware or even software, you suppress that possibility of discussing about the norm. In fact, you rigidify the norm in a hardware, and that's exactly a way of depoliticizing things. However, well, it's well-intentioned, of course, if you do privacy by design, all these things, and transparency by design, and automatic erasure of personal data after a certain time, etc. But doing that, you prevent contestation and contestability of norms. So that's why I'm a bit skeptic about that idea of Magna Carta and encoded values. I think if there are things that are not transcribable indeed in the form of digital data and code and digital code or computer code or algorithms, it's value. Values are never transcribable in this way, I think. And especially mercy, for example. Of course, you can transcribe up to a certain point procedural norms, legal procedural norms. But I would say justice is not the legal norm either. Justice is the excess of mercy sometimes over the codified norms. And if you reduce all that law is to legal texts, you completely forget all that part of all that kind of things. So I think also, well, to put values in code, instead of that, I would rather put human limitations in the code. I'm working on algorithmic governmentality myself, and it's kind of illimitation of cybernetics. And I think one of the problems which has not been addressed here is that those systems don't know at all the notion of limitation of the duration of human life, limitation of resources, and so on. All this is not transcribable into digital data, nor manageable by algorithms. So I think it's another kind of, it's not a value, it's a limitation rather than a value that we should put in the structure of the internet. And well, another, it's a small remark. You spoke about money as having as function the communication of intentions. I think the fundamental function of money is something else. The first man who first accepted a coin in exchange of a mutton or a sheep or a cow, he was crazy. That was trust, you know? And the fundamental value of money is trust, is the social bond, social link. And so is the value also of institutions in a way. I'm not buying your critique of institutions, and I'm not buying, you see what, but it's not really clearly said, but I'm sorry about that. And I think there is a huge mix between law, politics, institutions, the judiciary, and it would be very useful, I think, to distinguish all this and attack them separately.
Yeah, I mean, this was an overview of lots of very different things.
Yes.
So,
and I think also, you know, a specificity of law is that, despite of itself, it allows people to disobey. You know?
yeah.
And that's a huge difference with, for example, DRM, digital rights management, which indeed make law very effective. You cannot break the system, except if you are, well, if you can. Usual people can't, I mean, I can't, because I'm not very skilled in these matters. But a force of law, and the reason why law remains alive, I mean, and can be used as emancipatory tool is precisely because it allows disobedience, whereas code does not.
I agree with most of that.
The code and even algorithm are changing now as fast as written words.
Yeah.
So it's not a real limitation if something is encoded, whether in software, of course, and software is changeable from moment to moment.
Yeah.
And
No, but while the code is there, it only gives you one choice. So in case law, if the law says that something should not happen, then the case is what happened is that the thing that the law was speaking about, and should the law be interpreted this way or in that way, it's always context dependent. And context cannot be eliminated. And that is what code does.
Yeah.
Code works without context.
And
You can have a
case
abolition
law is
by law. The civil rights in the United States emerged from jurisprudence, from case
No,
law.
I agree that jurisprudence is where most law happens in common law and civil law systems. So case law doesn't exist in Sharia. It doesn't. It has a very, very different function in Talmudic law or Confucian law. You know, so comparative legal systems that have different functionalities, but absolutely within common law and civil law, the importance of case law shouldn't be understated. So one of the kind of overarching questions in all of this, and this is kind of coming back to where we started off from with Subsidiarity and the question of how do and Margaret Mead and Baden, how do we codify liberty? How do we accept the fact that we are going to have all these technological mechanisms, and even if we didn't have computers and technology, we still have pencils and paper, we still have all sorts of other technologies, horses, right, or whatever. There are all sorts of things, and they enable us on the one hand, and they limit us on the other. And in so doing, they are constructing our reality. They are enforcing certain behavior. And how can we just accept the fact that that's going to be the case always and has always been the case? while at the same time opening up the greatest amount of personal liberty that is possible. You know, some of this stuff might be absolutely wrong for that, but it's kind of a first draft. You know, we need to go through all those movements, and like you say, you don't buy my argument about against institutions. That's okay, but people who have gone through massive institutional abuse in some way, shape, or form are going to be more open to the idea of like, hey, can we replace this institution function, maintain its function in society while not having the avenue for abuse? You know, but protocols need to be revised as well.
Well, let me to bring it to my two of my favorite topics, which are free software and open standards. So I do think that there is that you don't want to. So I think there is this real clear and present danger, which was called out both by me and me very early in the game. That if you did cybernetize society, so you did make everything a bunch of protocols, it would be really fascist. Really, it would be a new kind of fascism that we've not seen coming before, but it would be even worse maybe than what they were just getting out of at the end of the 1940s, right? But let's think about this a little bit. I think it's not that. It's also not that simple because, as pointed out earlier, you know, in some countries you have well-functional jurisprudence, but this seems to be a declining amount. It's not increasing. I mean, maybe it's increasing. I know some people hear more positive than others, but my feeling and my personal experience is that it's decreasing. This is a problem. So of course we're going to look for ways to solve that problem. What's interesting about software is that there is. I think what you don't want to say, well, on one hand, there's this sort of world of human intervention and the law, and that's this very embedded social world. On the other hand, there's this sort of cold, hard world of total control, which is the software and the machine. Now, I mean, I think you can make arguments both ways, that intuitively is how it falls out. At the same point, what we see is that this world of law, for a lot of people, has become, and institutions become very distant. So they don't feel, you know, they don't understand what's going on there, and it seems to be purely operating to them like a sort of machine that they're alienated from. So they view attempts to fix that as something that could help them bring power back to them. And this world of code, on the other hand, is becoming over time, mostly because of the process around free software and later open standards, at the same time, more and more socially embedded. So that actually, like at least in the world I work in, it's a pharma standards body, it's my day job, you know, we argue constantly and have massive, essentially, we don't call it that, but that's what it is, jurisprudence-style decisions around software. We're engaging in one over DRM right now, right, at W3C. Is it possible to do it open source? Is it illegal? Would it violate local laws? Is it something we should have as part of the web? And these are, and what I think we have to understand is that the technical choices are essentially deeply political and ethical and socially embedded. And the problem is that historically most of the population has been disengaged from those technical discussions. So the technical discussions have happened in a fairly rarefied group of engineers, just as both in Soviet Russia and many people argue today in the United States that political decisions are made by a fairly rarefied group of bureaucrats and administrators, and their ethical dimensions are sort of like down there, sort of lost on most people. So I think it would be useful to engage more people, more process, and figure out how the good parts of jurisprudence could be kept, you know, in different fields, including technology. So technology doesn't strip power, it re-empowers people, and how the weird jurisprudence has somehow gone wrong, how you could establish checks on that. Right, so Snowden's obviously in a position, he wants some sort of check on what the U.S. government's doing, and at first he was like, we need to have a policy debate, but then that policy debate didn't happen, at least not very well. So the NSA is still there, Snowden's still in Russia, fairly miserable situation. So what else can he do? But say, well, we have to be able to encode these some other way.
I think just an idea, you know, Alexandre Kojève, who is who has studied law from mostly anthropological point of view and sociological point of view, philosophical as well, that a legal situation is characterized by one thing. is the presence of a third person with impartiality. You know, and that's the triangular structure also of the legal system. There is a legislative, executive, and judiciary. So if you want to have a jurisprudential system, even in other contexts than law, I think you must maintain that ternary structure. I think that's important.
So, but
It's the notion of intermediation.
If the entire system is hinging on the existence of somebody who has no opinion, you know, like such a person does not exist. This is one of the things that kind of is the traditional downfall of journalism. You know, is that journalism is always trying to.
If you don't have such person like a judge, you cannot have a jurisprudence nor call your system jurisprudence.
Well, but that's the thing. Like the judge has opinions. And you know, the judge does not have this view from nowhere, which is so highly respected.
No, it's not a view from nowhere. It's a very situated one, and the judge knows that he is dogmatic, but it's a dogmatism that is conscious of itself, and that's why you have appeal.
Mm-hmm.
You can revise judgments and so on.
Yeah.
It's very
Sure.
engaged. It takes a decision and exposes its responsibility.
Well, there's an interesting point in the open standards process where at least in the organization I work for, W3C, we do kind of have a judge. And it happens to be Tim Berners-Lee, just viewed as a very nice guy, who's generally putting forward partial. Now, there's going to be some problem when he dies or gets hit by a car or something. And maybe the solution to that sort of thing is trying to train people to be
Tim.
Yeah, well, no, I don't know if you want him, but he's a great guy. A world of Tims would be interesting. I would think you want to train people to have some of those characteristics that you would want in this sort of ideal fair judge. Train people to be sort of fair-minded, trying them to be situated, but try to be dogmatic, but yet still understand there will be differences in the field. Because what often you see in the internet, particularly in my line, the technical line, where Smári is also well aware of, is that people, because they're not socialized particularly well often. That's very nice. It's very hard sometimes to have sort of fair-minded, well-thought-through, reasonable decisions. Even, particularly I would say in software communities, which will lead to this sort of benevolent dictatorship phenomenon that we often see, of which Tim at W3C is kind of one of.
I always like the analogy between institutions and technologies, but I think the analogy should go in both ways. In a sense, institutions are like technologies. In a sense, technologies should be looked at more like institutions.
Yes.
What you have been emphasizing is to turn institutions into more like technologies.
Or protocols, yeah.
Well, I think you should also look at the others. Maybe the technologies should become more contextual, more flexible, more democratically controlled, and like that, more like institutions, which means that, as she said, that there are cases, that each case is different, it's a different context. There is not one rule that applies to all, and in one case you might want to copy a particular file, in another case you might want to keep it secret, and you should not have a fixed inbuilt rule that says it can never be copied, or it can always be copied.
So that work on protocolization of institutions is actually, I did it with Eleanor Saita, and when I was preparing this, I was kind of pulling together ideas from different strands of this line of thought. But one of the kind of important things that I left out from that bit of work is the observation that that networks don't have memory. So when you have a peer-to-peer communication protocol where everybody's just talking to each other and things are being decided and things are being acted through the protocol itself, there is no what we call institutional memory to remember which ideas were good, which decisions were good, and so on. And it was a bad omission to leave that bit out because it is really crucial. And what I think where the optimal bit is that you maintain institutions for the memory, but so that things like case law is a really good example. But move the executive authority from the institution to the protocol, so that decisions get made on the wire, between individuals who are communicating. but there is always this thing which knows what has happened, why it's happened, and what didn't work.